Most people have heard the story of Jesus walking on water, but many don't realize how drastically this story varies among the Gospels. The story is found in Mark 6, Matthew 14, and John 6, and the first halves of these accounts begin generally the same way. The disciples are sailing across the Sea of Galilee during a night with heavy wind while Jesus had remained behind. Suddenly, the disciples are terrified by Jesus walking on water. He tells them that it is him and to not be afraid. Mark is the only one of the three to say that Jesus intended to pass by the disciples. By the second half of the story, the accounts vary tremendously. In Mark, Jesus gets on the boat and the wind dies down. But then the narrator, seemingly out of the blue, says that the disciples had not understood the incident of the loaves. In Matthew, Peter decides to try walking on the water as well. And while initially successful, he starts sinking after seeing the strength of the wind. He calls out to Jesus, who saves him, and then Jesus criticizes him for his lack of faith. They both get onto the boat, the wind dies down, and the disciples acknowledge Jesus as the Son of God. In John, Jesus never gets into the boat because instead, the boat suddenly and miraculously teleports to the shore they were heading to. Then, John adds a story about the crowd from Tiberias, where he was before, coming across the water to look for him. Jesus then tells them to believe in himself. With such different accounts, the texts raise the question of why they were written in the way they were. In this video, I will argue that many of these varying elements reflect major themes in the three different Gospels. In Mark, the authority of the apostles is a central theme of the chapters preceding the walking on water. In Mark 3, the apostles were appointed by Jesus to be with him and to preach and have supernatural authority over demons. Then, up until Mark 6:6, the apostles carry out this task of being with Jesus. They see him work miracles, listen to him talk to people and tell parables, and have conversations with him. Then Jesus sends out the apostles, and they successfully cast out demons and heal people. After regrouping, hundreds of people gather around Jesus and the apostles, and when the crowd gets hungry, Jesus asks the apostles to feed them. When they don't, Jesus miraculously multiplies loaves and fishes to feed the crowd. The walking on water scene then occurs. Initially, Mark's detailed that Jesus intended to pass by the apostles seems like a very uncaring act. The apostles are struggling against the waves, and earlier in the gospel, Jesus demonstrated that he has the power to calm storms. However, within the theme of the apostles' authority, it's clear that Jesus thought that the apostles could calm the storm themselves. In that earlier calming of the storm story, the apostles have great faith in Jesus, seen in how they call out for him for help. However, surprisingly, after Jesus rebukes the wind, he criticizes them for their lack of faith. This passage only makes sense when considering that Jesus gave the apostles the authority to drive out demons. And this was a situation that seems to have involved driving out demons. The Greek word used when Jesus rebukes the wind in Mark 4:39 is the exact same word used as when he rebukes demons in 1:25 and 9:25. So it seems that the storm was of demonic influence. Considering this, the lack of faith Jesus accused the apostles of having must have been their lack of faith in the authority that he gave them. Therefore, in the walking on water story, Jesus must have intended to pass by them for the same reason. He knew they had the power to calm the storm themselves. So, they failed the test twice, even though they were able to drive out demons in between the two stories. Further evidence that authority is central to Mark's walking on water story is seen in the story's relationship to the loaves and fishes story in Mark 6:34-44. After Jesus calms the storm, he criticizes the apostles for not understanding the incident of the loaves. The part of that story it seems they didn't understand was when Jesus told them to give the crowd food themselves. The apostles interpreted this command as Jesus asking them to feed the crowd in a normal, natural way with their own food. However, it seems highly unlikely that Jesus legitimately thought that the disciples had enough food for hundreds of people, since it would have been pretty easy for Jesus to see if they happened to have this amount of food with them. If Jesus wasn't asking them to naturally feed the crowd, he must have wanted them to feed the crowd in a supernatural way, thinking that they could do it with their authority. Therefore, the reason they did not understand the incident of the loaves, as Jesus mentions in the walking on water story, seems to be that they didn't learn to trust in their own authority in either story. In objection to this interpretation, someone may point out that Jesus never appointed the apostles to do miracles of multiplication. However, in Mark, he also never appointed them to heal sick people, but they're still able to do that. Just see Mark 6:13. The emphasis in Mark is the apostles being given authority to do the same works Jesus does. And Jesus feeds people. Just look at the Last Supper. In Matthew's version of the walking on water story, he focuses on the faith of Peter. Peter initially shows great faith in both his own authority and Jesus' commands. He trusts that if it truly is Jesus walking on water and Jesus commands him to do the same thing, he can do it. However, he fails to walk more than a few steps because he doesn't have enough faith. Faith is a huge theme in Matthew. Matthew is the only gospel to include the concept of faith in why few mighty deeds were done in Nazareth, why Jesus cast the demon out of the Canaanite woman's daughter, why the disciples didn't understand the teaching about the leaven of the Pharisees, why the disciples couldn't cast out a man's son's demon, and in explaining why the disciples abandoned Jesus at his passion. Matthew's gospel also places specific interest in the understanding and faithfulness of Peter, presumably because Matthew is the only gospel to include Jesus giving primacy of authority to Peter. Therefore, Matthew's inclusion of a story of Peter's faith in the walking on water story makes a lot of sense. In John, the people from Tiberias come, and Jesus tells them that the work of God is to believe in himself, and that this leads to eternal life. Within John's gospel, this passage makes a lot of sense, as belief in Jesus is central to his gospel. The word belief is used 97 times in John, while it only appears 34 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined. The idea that belief in Jesus leads to salvation begins in the prologue, with John saying that Jesus gives the power to become children of God to those who believe in him. This concept is then repeated many times in the gospel. And so, Jesus' signs, which means his miracles in John, are what lead to belief in those that witness them. Therefore, John adding a story of Jesus exhorting people to believe in him after they witness a miracle of his is entirely unsurprising. Altogether, these varying accounts demonstrate one central difference between the Synoptic Gospels and John. The Synoptics emphasize actions, while John emphasizes belief. Matthew and Mark do both emphasize faith. However, for them, faith is necessarily connected with actions. The apostles' faith is tested in Mark by whether they calm the storm, and Peter's faith is tested in Matthew by whether he walks on water. Therefore, in the Synoptics, ultimately, actions are what determine if one is saved or not. Just see Matthew 25. In John, however, simply whether or not you believe in Jesus is what determines if you're saved or not. Therefore, for us, to treasure both traditions today, it's necessary for the church to both preach to inspire belief and to live out works of mercy. Thank you so much for watching.